This is Good Girl Gone Human, an ongoing conversation that serves the frequency of rehumanization. We believe that in striving towards being good and away from being bad, we can lose touch with our humanity and uniqueness. Our hope is that in expanding our capacity to accept our own humanity, we expand the capacity to accept and hold each other's humanity as well.
We welcome uncertainty and questions with curiosity. This is not a roadmap for the right way to be human. We hold tenderly how seductive and human it is to reach for a formula that will provide a sense of certainty and safety. This is not that place, but rather a place for dropping into our big, messy questions.
This isn't just for the recovering good girls out there, but for every human who desires to peel off the layers that hide the wholeness of who they are.
We want to tell the stories of how messy and complicated and beautiful it is to find ourselves in the aftermath of this shedding. There is space for your story, and we want you to join us on this journey of rehumanization. Hi, humans. Hi, Holly.
Hi, Christina.
Welcome back to another episode of Good Girl Gone Human. We're so excited because today we have a new friend with us today, RG Shore. Hi, RG. So happy to have you here today. RG is another Instagram friend turned real life friend. RG Shore is the founder of Northwest Wisdom, which is a nonprofit in the Pacific Northwest for embodied spirituality. RG is a formerly incarcerated person, a person of color, a spiritual teacher, a spiritual counselor, social justice advocate. And he's also the award-winning author of his book, The Ocean Inside Me. Look, we're both like, ta-da, hold it up. The Ocean Inside Me, a spiritual memoir on healing racial trauma. And that's a lot of labels. We kind of joked about how so much of this podcast is about putting down labels. And then we're like, label yourself. Like, tell us all your labels. But I think it's important too, just to, present who people are. But we're so grateful to have you here this morning, RG. Thank you.
Oh my gosh, I'm just honored to be with you both. Thank you. And yes, like at the end of the day, we're all just people trying to figure it out. Like that's the label, I guess. It's like
that's it.
I'm just here trying to figure it out. So
yeah,
appreciative of all the labels that you have mentioned, but
yeah, and also human. We
also
always
human.
Like to end on and just a human alongside us.
A human that has been imposed some labels on you and also taken some on just so people could find you, counselor, that's so people could find you. So all these are necessary, but we're really excited to, we want to acknowledge we named a bunch of things. So we are going to over the next hour, unpack that with you, RG. So thank you for coming and sharing your humanity with us. And I guess to start, in your book, you talk a lot about healing your relationship with your inner child, and that's been a really important part of all of your healing. And so could we start by you telling us a bit about growing up or whatever you want to share about that beginning part of your life?
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks for asking. To start off by saying is like a lot of the work that I was doing when I was incarcerated, I didn't have, access to Instagram. I didn't have access to TED Talks like I write in the book. Is like I just had my body. That was it. And what's so interesting about that is the body will naturally guide you where he, she, it, they need to go. And so trusting those instincts. When I was doing the inner child work, I had no clue that IFS was a thing, right? Like I had no clue that these things existed. And I say this because it's really important to know that these sort of like systems in place that are there to help are just that. They're there to help. And so if something doesn't land with you, then there's always something else that might land with you. And so I was discovering these things because my body was naturally showing me the way to those healings. So for any listeners who are like, I don't know what this thing is, or I don't really trust this, that's okay. Just lean into trusting your body.
And just for the listeners real quick, IFS is internal family systems, also known as parts work. So you're saying you didn't have the model laid out for you, but you had your body and your soul. And
yeah.
Right. Yeah. And it's just really interesting talking about going beyond the labels, right? Because you go beyond the labels and IFS doesn't exist to someone who hasn't had access to IFS, but they do have still access to who they were, who they've always been.
Mm.
And so to answer your question, growing up, I'm a person of color. I'm a, brown person. I was born in the East, like I say, but I was raised in the West. So that kind of dichotomy of physiologically, my body knows sort of Eastern
Mm.
principles and Eastern customs, but being raised in the West, those sort of cultural customs kind of, they sort of came up sort of resisting each other, even if that was subconscious. So being born in India, I was put in an orphanage, never knew my birth parents, and then I was adopted as a baby to a white family in the Pacific Northwest, which is known for its sort of liberal views, but also it's very, very just white culture. There's not a
Mm-hmm.
lot of people of color in the Pacific Northwest, and so growing up a brown kid who didn't know his family to a white family, that automatically sets the stage for, some
So
great
much.
tragedy.
Yeah. Truly. I think, in your book too, you talk about these stories of like what it was like to be in your body where you were growing up. And one of those things was even like 9/11, being in middle school. We're a similar age, I realized when you were telling that story. And being in middle school when that happened and how people around you, like you can humanize those kids too. They had like their own parents were probably feeding them some of these stories that were then being like just put on you. And it just
Yeah,
feels so
and
hard.
like I'm, as a brown kid who's pretty short, it's like I tell people I'm 5'4" with a man bun, like it's um like at the time, like, any kid is going to be worried more about like their pimples and their clothes and sort of these materialistic things that are natural to be worried about at age 12, 13, 14. But all of a sudden, it was like, I was thrown into this world of being worried about, my safety in regard to people calling me Osama or whatever they were calling me as a 13, 14-year-old. The lens changed for what I had already been in kind of survival mode my whole life. That even sort of shifted even more because of everything that was sort of happening globally.
Yeah, it put it like on display. It was like maybe it wasn't even subtle before, but it certainly wasn't subtle after, that event, that there was clear, blatant racism and like harm being done to you with such little knowledge of who you are, people just like spitting names at you. It's so
Yeah.
wild. Yeah. I think too, like, I'm curious about what your family that you grew up in, like what their faith tradition was. Was there faith in your family? Was there faith in your household? What was that like?
Yeah, well, thanks for asking. I grew up Catholic,
Okay.
and so sort of raised in that we go to church, we love the donuts afterwards. We're not sure why we're going down on our knees and then up, you know,
Yeah.
all the ritualistic things I wasn't so sure of. I, credit to my parents, there wasn't ever like an indoctrinating, like you have to believe these things. So that's one positive thing about the family that I grew up in was like there was a little more spaciousness to kind of discover, but there wasn't ever communication and conversation around that discovery. So it was like, my dad's was a lawyer and my mom was a counselor, and so, you know, grew up in an educated home, but like there was never any real communication in the family. And so communication about my skin color, communication about like where I was from, communication about sex, about like growing up Catholic, and then, the pressure of like I want to fit in, and a lot of the people I wanted to fit in with in middle school came from the evangelical realm of Christianity.
Mm.
So it was like, what is youth group? I have no idea what that is, but I'll try it out. What are like retreats? Like I remember the first time in high school, I went to like what was called like a overnight, like they call it like a lock-in or
Yeah.
something, something silly. Um, and that was the first time I was exposed to the series Left Behind, which I'd never seen before.
Good Lord.
And that was terrifying,
Yeah.
to be like,
Totally.
what is this lock-in? I thought it was like popcorn and hamburgers, and all of a sudden I'm watching like,
Scary.
anyway,
A scary movie.
Yeah.
yes, yeah, and so it was like entering this very fear-based culture with like already as a fear-based body, right?
Hmm.
And no conversation around being a brown person, not once, like ever. Um,
That had to
so
have
that was
been
kind of the faith
confusing.
I grew up in was like, a lot of what I write about in my book, and or what at least what I hint about is part of the mystic in me is I've always been in a space of neither here nor there, right? I've always been in that liminal space between um, like breath and inhale and exhale. And so, it's like being a brown person, but also kind of being raised white, right? Or being Catholic and then also being, fundamentally evangelical, whatever that looks like, but then having physiological like ties to Eastern religion. So there's always just been this, as I call it, liminal space where I just don't quite fit any one thing. And that's a really lonely, scary, isolating place to be. Um, so that was kind of the framework of the construct that I grew up in was when I had therapy, my therapist told me, in all the years I've done this, I've never met someone who's a better fawner than you, right?
Oh,
Which I talk about in my book, is fight, flight, or freeze, but there's also fawning, which is less known. And I don't know if,
I'm
I
a
don't want to
I'm a
put that.
recovering fawner as well. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And so this idea, fawning, for listeners, is this idea of the ability to adapt like to a situation for survival, for feeling seen or heard or whatever it is. Like when you grow up as a brown person in a white culture, like you automatically are fawning every day. But with everything else added onto it, I just became extremely good at everything except knowing who I was.
Mm.
And that creates a wound that takes years and years to begin to see. And often addressing that wound takes an unraveling of discovering who you are not in order to discover who you are.
Boom. That's like such a mic drop. I'm like, yeah, like, and that's this whole thing of moving beyond these labels. Like, you can't move beyond them until you name them. Because it's standing out to me that even in your family growing up, that there was no discussion around your brownness. Like, that they probably were trying to, I'm sure that was a loving action in their minds, right? Like, we just want you to be part of the family and we're not trying to like single you out. But in not naming it, it was actually harmful, like you can't move past a label until you see what that label is and like hold it in your hands. That juxtaposition just feels really clear to me right now as you're talking. The
Yeah,
importance of
yeah, and
talking.
the idea of trying to figure it out, right? Like
Yeah.
survival, when you're born into survival mode, I think you automatically are just trying to figure it out. Um, so you're not only just trying to hold on, but you're trying to figure it out. I used to wander. Like my parents tell me when I was a baby, I would wander. I'm like, oh, that's fitting. Like physically wandering, but also like makes a lot of sense, right? That spiritual, like that spiritual discontent, like projects or manifests itself physically. Um, and that's always the case. And so, here I was trying to figure it out. And then as a baby, I was kind of escaping the house and wandering the neighborhoods like in a diaper, like, so there's a real truth to often the wounds are deep and often they're, more than one lifetime long. And they're sort of these repetitive patterns of abandonment wounds or, wandering or not knowing who you are, not knowing your own identity. Um, and sometimes the gift of being in that liminal space is there's more room to discover you're not any one thing. Um, like I said, it's a very lonely place to be, but it at least kind of sets you up for that space of, okay, this is the work. I am more than all this stuff. Then means everybody else is more than all the labels and the things that they believe about themselves as well.
Absolutely. And when you were in that young, lonely, liminal place, like, of course, you could talk about it now with ease, but it wasn't really named or labeled, or there wasn't even like a safe person you could bring it to. So, when you were in that space, did you have any awareness or start to name, or did that come later when things started to unravel?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So, like when you're in survival mode and also like fawning, you tend to be up here, right? Like your brain is trying to make sense and trying to survive, and there's not a lot of embodiment. And so, and then growing up in Christian culture, there was zero embodiment because, for my experience, Christian culture is all about like ego, and it's about the mind and like proving people wrong and establishing your position, right?
Yeah.
And when you are in that mindset and that framework of establishing your position at all times, you're not actually doing any of the real embodiment work. And so a lot of my experiences growing up was all here. Like I said, my dad's a lawyer and he's one of the smartest people I've ever met. And so there was this level of I have to be perfect, right? I have to be good at everything, and I became really, really good at everything except for just being me, right? And so the dichotomy that kind of came in high school was like I got really, really good at art and music and sports and grades and making people laugh and all of those things, but yet within me there was a being that said, I want people to like me for just who I am. But the response was always like, "Oh, you're such a good musician. You're such a good artist. You're such a good whatever. You're so funny." But none of that encapsulated. But why don't you just like me for me? And because I was never taught that in my family growing up, I didn't even know that that was a really an emotion, right? That's sort of a subconscious emotion, because everything is still just like up here, probably even through college. Um, yeah.
Yeah, and in college you did religious studies, right? Was that your major in college?
Yeah, I joke it was my major and my minor. Um, yeah, it's funny. I went to a Christian college and got some really good, scholarships and stuff, but I just felt super out of place, like always. But even more so that I ended up transferring to a bigger state college. And in transferring, I started taking classes on Eastern religion and just felt very much at home. Like it felt very like, okay, I feel closer to what I have always thought the divine to be. Again, there was always this like resistance in me in Christian culture of like, I don't know if my body actually agrees with this. Like my mind is making sense of it, but my body is like, something feels off about the exclusions, about sort of, the way that the culture is projected onto the belief inherently, right? And being not born of this culture, that that was where there was resistance. It was like this feels more of a projection of white America than it does Christianity, right? And I couldn't make sense of that. And so studying world religions, studying Eastern religions, studying all of it gave me a better breadth of an understanding of maybe the universe, which I use the term universe, but you can call it God or love or kindness or whatever you want to call it, Christ. Um, the universe for me was like, what if I'm much bigger than the thing that you've been taught? And that's also a very scary place to be. So yeah.
Yeah, that's very vulnerable when you're like, but also is probably very freeing. Like, okay, I was on to something, it's not this little box and everything doesn't have to fit neatly in here. And you talk about how like people's perception of God is like really more a reflection of ourselves, right? And who we think we are. And so I hear that too. And even just like, there's something bigger here. Like I can't squeeze into this box. And that would make sense for you too, right? Like there's no box that you necessarily fit in your life. So it would make sense that when God, universe, spirit became bigger than that, that was like probably more of a coming home sort of moment for you.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, what could God, I always go to like, how could God not just be a projection of yourself, right? Like if you're here in this space, if you're in the space you're at and you're like, where else could you be? So how could God be anything other than the projected experiences you have had? Um, and so that's where the compassion comes in, right? The compassion for my oppressor, the compassion for, you know, whoever it may be that has pushed against your own belief system is like, the compassion is, oh, they only know what they know, right? Like, we only ever know what we know, and what we know is based upon kind of what we've experienced.
Mm.
Um, and and that ties into belief too, right? Because someone can say, no, 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 I believe something. Well, your belief is also based upon your experience, that experience of someone saying you should believe in something. Um,
Yeah.
and so there is a real idea of, if we are just the universe in this form, then someone else is the universe in their form.
Hmm.
And so then, of course, God is always going to look like that individual experience. And that is freeing, because that tells me, oh, this person over here is only experiencing probably what they need to experience.
Interesting.
Yeah, those ideas I feel like in your book, in the time that you were incarcerated, like were really huge too, like seeing other people's humanity in that way, that like the stories that were given to them are the stories that they're like living out. And it's empowering to know that we don't have to just keep like living those stories over and over again. But I was so struck by your stories of, and not that it was easy there, you could feel the tension within you as you're like looking at people, your oppressors in all different kinds of forms, and saying like, this is the story that you're living right now. This story was handed to you by somebody too. There's so much kindness and like compassion in being able to see people that way. And we say this all the time, like part of our work in trying to expand to hold the wholeness of our own humanity is so that we can hold other people's humanity too. And I just see that so clearly, like in your story, in ways that are so confronting and so challenging, because the justice system in America is like, you know, you talk about the macro and the micro in your book too, like that we can't heal these macro traumas and injustices if we're not willing to look at the micro. And so I think there's like so much metaphor in your lived experience too that's like so important. And I want to talk more about your like time and what that was like for you being incarcerated, but tell us a little bit between college. So you're like in college, you're doing religious studies. Like, take us through what happened next.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of college is like faking it till you make it, right? Like there's
Totally.
this level of like, I've done it, and now what? And
Yeah,
the pressure, I think I read somewhere once that your 20s is actually the hardest decade, right? And I thought
I
a lot
believe
about,
it.
why is that true? And I realized it's because, like, for those who want you to be an adult, you're not quite an adult. And for those who want you to be young, you're not quite young, right?
Mm.
So there's this level of like, you're in that liminal space of, hurry up and get old, but we're also not going to respect you yet because you're not
Mm.
old. And so again, there's just this process of really trying to figure it out. And so in my 20s, I did what any 22-year-old would do in 2010, which was go and get your master's degree, right? Like, I mean, because why not? Because everybody else is.
Mm-hmm.
Like, why not take out a $50,000 student loan on shit that
Why
doesn't
not?
matter? And
Yeah.
so I went and got my master's, and within 3 or 4 months, I like just was like, this program is not for me. I don't like it. I don't know what I'm going to do. And without going into the hairy details that don't matter, I ended up getting a teaching job in New Mexico, where I was teaching world religions, kind of near the reservations. And then from there, I went and got my master's degree in education. Um, and then it was a lot of wandering and a lot of like, and all of this is way before the conversation of trauma, and way before the conversation of
Mhm.
like healing and therapy, and that stuff is not, it's not part of um, what society is talking about and encouraging. And so a lot of whatever was going on within me was going on within me without me knowing it.
Mm.
That's a huge part of the wound work, is like, no one's talking about this. I don't know how I feel. I'm still brown. I've always been brown. Um, I'm lonely. Never feeling good enough. Like, I think a part of the conversation that people of color have is like, you are working twice as hard to just get at the base level of what white people just
Oh.
live,
Mm-hmm.
and so there's this level of like, look, if I do kind of the average just to get there, my energy is already kind of spent.
Yeah.
So then I'm working more to like increase my value, right, so to speak. So there was a lot of that going on, which is I'm glad we're talking about it now. I'm glad it's um, a part of the macro conversations. But for a long period of time, it was just kind of a hold it in. You hold it in and you keep going. Sort of that American American status is you just work hard and then things will present themselves to you.
Mm.
And so there was a lot of yeah, there was a lot of pushing against what looked good on the outside. Um, you know, um, these sort of high, like hierarchical ladders we climb. I quote it in my book, and it's one of my favorite quotes. Is Merton? He says it's like climbing a ladder, and you reach the top, and you realize the ladder's leaning up against the wrong wall,
Mm.
right? And that's predominantly kind of what our system is built on. Is this idea of you just get to the top, whatever that looks like, and
Mm-hmm.
it ends up serving nobody. And then what do you do?
Yeah.
And so after I was getting my master's degree, I was working in New Mexico, and I met a priest named Father Richard Rohr who helped mentor me a lot. And just we talked about Christ, and we talked about I was unraveling my own what people call deconstruction
Mm-hmm.
back in about 2011, and it was like I couldn't help but understand, but believe that like there was a difference between Jesus and Christ, and that to me was scary because nobody was talking about it, and so kind of being led into those types of conversations of that liminal space and conversations of non-duality and what does it mean to like open myself up to these things that anyone would call me a heretic for, right? Anyone would call
Totally.
me.
Mm-hmm.
I'm already, like I said, my whole life has been about trying to fit in and feel
Mm.
included and feel good enough. And yet my spirituality is saying, let all of that go. Um, is sort of the constant pattern of don't allow people to define your worth,
Mm.
even though your whole body is constantly working overtime to produce enough to feel valuable.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's such a big conversation around like consumerism and capitalism wrapped up in that too. Like just produce. Your value is in what you can like give others, society. Totally.
Yeah, it's doing versus being, right?
Yeah.
And where that's the market. The market is do, produce, and your value is based upon your ability to produce something that is of value to other people. And in that position, your mind is always future and present. It's like, what did I fuck up?
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
And then how can I not fuck up? But meditation and presence is always right here, and the body is always just right here. Um, there's the body doesn't know future, and the body is just about being present.
Mm.
And so, yeah, I think getting older and going through that, it was a clash of I didn't know any better. Like I was just trying to survive, and we were just trying to survive. Like I often tell people when you're out in the desert looking for water, you don't have time to like figure out why your daddy doesn't love you, you know?
Sure. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
there's a real truth to like being a brown person in a white world, even though I maybe consciously didn't know it, I was just in survival mode my entire life.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that self-awareness is like a luxury, right? Like you
Yeah.
have to have
Right.
margin for that.
For sure.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
There's like so much depth and beauty
Mm-hmm.
in all of it, and like how it all just that you Richard Rohr's come up a lot on the podcast. It's so funny.
Interesting.
It
You're
must be like
the
a
third or fourth guest,
I know. He's just,
and
but
we've
I-
only had like 7 guests. Yeah.
It makes sense. It's on our frequency, He's
Totally.
definitely like someone I love, and I'm just like I love that you had personal time with him and that he got to mentor you. I just think that's really special. He's
Yeah,
someone I
actually,
admire.
I got to have a conversation with him the night before I went to prison. We talked on the phone for quite a while, and one of the things he said that has always stuck out to me, which is like, this he was like, fully believe this is actually the beginning of something for you.
Which is so
Nothing.
hard to be told, even though it ended up being true. Like,
Yeah,
fuck
yeah. I mean,
this.
look, like you're just it's just a whirlwind of like, okay, here we go. Like I don't,
Wow.
you know, and in my experience, it's like when you're ready to let go of the things you need to let go of,
Hmm.
the universe will meet you there. And also, like, be kind of careful what you wish for.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
In,
Yeah.
in some ways, it's like, okay, this is it. Like, this is the death work.
Yeah.
I often tell people you can't die without dying,
Hmm.
and we live in a world that is doing everything it can to like not die.
For
Um,
sure.
and so that's the spiritual work, is like allow the death to exist.
Mm.
Um, and don't rush it. You can't rise without dying either. So,
Yeah.
um,
And a
yeah,
lot
there's
of
a real
your,
truth just sitting in it.
for sure. And a lot of your book is about like learning to deeply sit with because you had no other choice. That transformation, that metaphorical death. Can you tell us, to whatever comfort level you want to, just kind of like that story of becoming incarcerated
Yeah.
and your journey? Like so much of, I hope people read the book. Of just what that actual experience of being a brown person in an almost all white prison was like. So whatever you want to like take us to that journey.
Yeah, I mean, look, we're a curious bunch, us human beings,
For
and so
sure.
I honor that.
Mm-hmm.
And so without going into too much detail for, honoring myself and honoring everyone else, it's like
Mm-hmm.
the reality is I was in a relationship with someone who was a month away from being 18, and they were in college. I didn't know. And, when I found out, it was how do we navigate this thing? And I did my best every step of the way with integrity to figure out how to honor and remove myself from the situation. But, when you're an unhealthy person and you're also with another unhealthy person, that can kind of create just more wound, right?
Yeah.
And that's just the best way to put it, is like just saturated in wound. And I've always taken responsibility for my action. And also part of the work that I do now is realizing I've never been that thing, right? And we're never the thing. And so that's the real deep shame work, and that's the real deep like worthiness work that I do, is like it's so easy to project onto people things that we want to project because we haven't yet worked it out within ourselves. Um,
Yes.
and when I was in prison, the constant like meditative like spiraling was like, why universe? It honestly could have been anything else. It could have been
Mm-hmm.
gambling. It could have been, you know, maybe going home from the bar a little bit buzzed and accidentally like getting a DUI. And as a former teacher, that would have been enough to lose my license. Like there could have been so many things along the way that I often ask the universe, why this sort of like arbitrary thing that really doesn't encapsulate who I am at all.
Yeah.
Um, and over time, the universe made it pretty clear. It's like you have to be willing to sit kind of with the worst labels, um, to realize you're not that label. And in holding space for all these such like deep, scary labels that the world gives us, if you hold that space and see that you're not that thing, you actually end up holding space enough that people see that not only are they not that thing either, but you're not that thing. And so then that creates this conversation of, oh, if I can see it in you, then I can see it in myself. And if I can see it in myself, I can see it in everybody else. And that's where the real transformation comes in.
Absolutely. Like it has to start as individuals. And I'm just really struck by what you just said that um, you are willingly sharing your story and sharing your process of gathering as many labels as you could, funny, like musical, like all these things. And then it was just this deep loneliness that is a very acceptable American, like Western loneliness. And you got all the ones you possibly could. And now here you are on the other side of a really terrible, like metaphorical death story, sharing with all of us the beauty that like you can drop the labels because you're just worthy because you're alive. And I'm just really struck by the beauty of the invitation that your story is for everyone individually. And then if we all take on that work individually, that's where we find collective healing.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for saying that. And thank you for sitting with it and holding it. eventually, when I was incarcerated, I ended up studying law, and the law led me to becoming essentially the prison lawyer for
Hmm.
everybody, including my oppressors, right? Including the white supremacists I was sleeping next to, and the neo-Nazis, and what I learned in those situations was all about labels too, right? Because here's this, person coming in with swastikas all over their face, tattooed in arms, and they're looking at me and they're thinking like, oh, this is just the N-word, right? Like
Mm.
constantly. And I'm sitting here thinking like, oh, okay, this is the meditation, like this is the work. And if I ever want this person to see my brownness, I have to not only see their white supremacyness, but I have to see their white supremacyness within myself, because that's how
Right.
they then see the brownness within themselves. And so it's a really like a transmuting of labels. And you honor that communicative energy, and
Mm.
that's really the only way forward. But what an interesting position as a brown person to sit and take on that label of white supremacist,
Yeah, what was
just to
that
heal
like?
and just to go beyond that.
What was that like? Like, what did you find when you did that in that process?
Yeah, I don't romanticize it. I mean, it sometimes can look romanticized when you're writing it down in a book. It's really hard work and it sucks. It
Mm.
sucks to sit in that, to have someone call you an N-word and say, "Help me get my child back." And you're like, Jesus, okay. I mean, I
Wow.
guess,
Yeah.
and here we are. So in real time, I often tell people meditation, like if you can't find it in the mess, you're not going to find it in the mountains, right? And so this sort of glorified spirituality of like go off and do shrooms in the forest and find yourself. A lot of people don't have that luxury, especially people of color, especially marginalized communities.
Mm.
So this is the meditation work, is this stuff where you're like sitting across from a white supremacist and you're helping them try to get their kid back, right? Like that's the real work. And so part of that process is noticing I know I'm not this profoundly awful label that people give me. So why am I still like trying to project this label onto this other person? Like regardless of the tattoos, regardless of the language they're using, what is really going on underneath? And so a part of my strategy was applying my meditative work, which was going in and doing the inner child work, and applying that to the people I was working with. So sitting across them, I'd say, who is this person at 6 years old? And what are they going through at 4 or 5 or 6 or 7? What, how are they not seen? How are they not validated?
Mm.
And how can I honor and validate them even in this impossible situation? And I found more often than not, you have to be willing to do the work first, which is the ego death, right? Like it's not I do 50 and they meet me 50. It's I do 120 and they meet me negative 30 most of the time. It's like that's
Hmm.
real truth. And also that's still the meditation that we're called to. And only over time with a few people did like that sort of like illusion begin to break. Um, and that was enough, right? It was like, oh, maybe he isn't the N-word, right? You're like, yeah, I don't know if anybody is, like,
Mhm.
and here
Yeah.
we are, like trying to be human with each other. So that's part of what the process looks like is you have to be grounded in yourself enough to know yourself enough to not be perturbed by the labels and by the value system that these people are giving you. And then only in that space can you have enough space for the other, right? Um, that's the work. And so, like you said, Holly, it starts here. It starts with the self. And a part of the work I was doing was macro, micro work and realizing, everything is happening on a macro level is happening right here. I was incarcerated during the death and murder of George Floyd, right?
Mm.
And, one of the things I put together, like in my meditation, was like, here's this here's this man who died because someone was putting, their knee on their neck, right? And they murdered him. And I thought, interesting enough how like COVID was happening at a macro level and people were dying because they also couldn't breathe. Like
Hmm.
at a much larger level, it was like this thing. It was like the universe was coming in on behalf of George Floyd in some ways. It's like if you can't see it within yourself, you can't see it anywhere. And I felt that violence and that aggression in the prison. I heard the cheering from white supremacists when that happened, and a part of that was like, I am locked in. There's nowhere I can go. Why then can I feel the heat of the entire country?
Wow.
And that really was this process of, again, if you can't, if you feel it here, you begin to understand the much larger patterns that are at play.
Yeah. Wow. I know. Good breath. I mean, it's true. It's the stuff that we talk so much about, the word dehumanizing on our podcast, and the way we've experienced that, even just the three of us in this conversation, looks very different. But I was very emotional reading about just how dehumanizing prison is. And that's obvious and that's clear, but just from your personal experience and the contrast of your experience when you were then out of prison and just experiencing the connection to the earth. Like there was just so many macro, micro moments of even that dehumanizing work that we do and trying to rehumanize ourselves. And so I just see like, there's just so much to your story. My brain is like swirling. I'm just like, yeah, like the way people were treating each other inside there. We talked about sobriety and like AA just with another guest, and how like everyone coming into that room almost had this humility. Like, I'm not better than you. You're not better than me. And so it's interesting that like in prison, you kind of could think the same thing would happen. Like, we're all here. We all fucked up. But that's not the, perspective that's happening in there. You were saying, everything is almost amplified more inside there. People's pride, people's ego. And that experience must have been so interesting to see, like, we all screwed up here, like in some way. And yet the ego.
First off, what space you hold. So thank you for holding that space, and like just the beauty of your insight of like sitting with all these metaphors. So thank you. What I wrote in the book, I think really reads true, which is like, prison is not a reflection of prison. It's a reflection of America.
Wow.
And so how could you not create the system inside that
Right.
is just at a macro level created in our country? And so, yes, you would like to think that, hey, we've all just fucked up. But part of the reason why people are in prison is because of the value that society has placed on them to begin with. So then you go into that system with that same value system. It was like, it was disbelief at first to realize, oh, like you only sit at tables with the same, like, race, right? Like the natives sit with the natives, the paisas or Mexicans sit with the Mexicans, the whites sit with the whites. Like it's, and then also you sit back, you're like, well, what else could it be? Right? Like this is a projection of a much larger problem. And the penal system, the incarceration system is a reflection of this idea of we need to punish people because we don't feel love or validated ourselves, right? At a much sort of more structured political level. And so, of course, it doesn't work. And of course, then you sort of go into this like really structured, they call it politics, and it's all just politics. The things you can do, the things you can't do, and they're very arbitrary. And then I like sit back in my meditation and realize, well, so are the rules in our country. It's all
Seriously.
made up,
Arbitrary. Yeah.
and it's all bullshit, and it's all oppressive and made to create a structure of marginalized being oppressed. And then like, I mean, it's all a manufactured thing. So, the incarceration system's got to go. I often tell people I was a teacher, like, in a former life. And it's like, imagine if, like, Susie over here, like called little Jimmy, like, a jerk. And you're like, okay, Susie, go stand in the corner for 4 years. Like, it just is so
Yeah.
silly
Right.
and doesn't do anything. And yet, in a society of hurt and wound, people need to see winners and losers. And the only way to call yourself a winner, if you haven't experienced that, is to make sure that somebody else is the loser.
Is losing.
And the real meditation work says that the oneness that we actually all are is, if there's a wound over here, then there's a wound over there. And if there's a wound over there, there's a wound here. And you
Wow.
can't separate that out.
I'm really struck by this conversation because I'm sitting with like what you said a few minutes ago, Christina, that we all are working with the word dehumanize in our own way. And there is a part of me that's like, how could I ever say that about myself after hearing the story that you're telling us, RG? And the connection I'm making in this moment is we grew up in like that white American Christianity a little bit further down the coast than you. But the word punishment is really coming through. It's like I grew up believing like I deserve to be punished just because of sin, period. You're born sin. So it's just interesting to take everything you're saying and like contemplate how we are like mirrors for each other. And like what I experienced in a micro way is very different from what you experienced, but we're swimming in like the same soup. And how my journey of rehumanization personally has looked like, what if we don't deserve to be punished? What if we can expand to like, heal our inner child and embrace the wholeness of who we are so that we can do that for others? So I'm doing that work in this like really different, like my experience as like a white girl growing up in California is so different. And what I hear you saying is like, there is a sameness to this incarceration is just like this like throbbing wound that's like, look, this has been wrong the whole time, and look, it's this concentrated poison. I keep hearing the word like poison. And so just like pulling on threads here, but I want to ask, lean into the curiosity of, you said incarceration doesn't work. It's not the way it needs to go. And it rings true for me as someone who like doesn't, I'm here to learn, like I don't know. But I know for in my own story how punishment doesn't work.
Yeah.
And I'm not doing that to my kids. And so you're experiencing that in another way. So what do you mean that it has to go? What do you mean? Like, can you talk a bit more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I first want to validate your experience and your story. It's like I often tell people trauma doesn't discriminate and wound doesn't discriminate. So it doesn't matter if you're in war or prison or a car crash, right? Your body experiences trauma. And it's the same with the wound, right? So in validating your experience, yeah, you're not a brown person who's been incarcerated, but and this is a huge assumption, and so I'm so sorry, but
Go for it.
I think you probably identify as a woman, but again, a big
I do.
assumption. So I'm sorry, but also like being a woman in a Christian society that oppresses women is the same. It's the same fucking thing.
Yeah.
And so like you having to grow up, there's a level of survival ship that looks the exact same in some ways, right? And so the whole point of humanizing is going beyond the label. And the whole point of going beyond the label is seeing the energy underneath the thing. And when you get deep enough and see that energy, you see, oh, it's all the same energy. It's an energy of wound. It's an energy of I don't feel good enough. I don't feel worthy. I mean, when I look at sin, that word sin, it's the same as prison. There's no difference, right? And the energy is the same thing. It's a you are not good enough. You've done something bad. You don't deserve, and then you fill in the blank.
Right.
Yeah.
And so a part of the process of undoing, Christians or like people who don't identify as Christians anymore, they call it deconstruction, right? Well, there's a much larger deconstruction going on, and that deconstruction actually goes all the way down to the worthiness. And I call it the worthiness wound, which is like you go all the way down into the self and you say, there's something that has never felt worthy. And when you learn how to transform that, the rest of it changes. Because then you see all these labels and all these narratives and all these stories, they don't matter. They're imaginative and they don't exist. And so when I say it has to go, the penal system has to go, yes, at a very surface level, basic political like construct, yes, prisons have to go. They're only serving the rich and serving the oppressor. Like,
Yeah.
look at privatizations of prisons, look at the ratio of like people of color. I mean, you could just go on and on and on with statistics. But what I'm saying at a deeper level is the wound has to go. And the wound only goes when we realize and transform that wound into worthiness. So you have to be willing to go through that transformation process. And when you do it here, it projects everywhere else. And that's the real key is when I learned about myself and that meditation with George Floyd is like, oh man, this violence and this heat out there is here. But then I realized the inverse is true, meaning if I'm experiencing all this darkness here because of what out there is like, that means the inverse is if I become light here, that will automatically project out. And so the key isn't trying to push darkness and push change. The key is to become change and become light, and that will project and manifest itself at a macro level.
Yeah.
And then those systems like the incarceration system, then those things start to automatically shift.
Yeah, that's so profound. I feel it on, I feel embers of hope in the way I see parenting shifting, for example, like talk about punishment. And I see like Dr. Becky, I don't know if you know her, she's a parenting expert, but her book is called Good Inside. And it's like, that's her whole thing is like approaching your children from a place of their goodness, right? So instead of punishing you for your tantrum, I'm going to recognize that you don't have the skills to deal with whatever that was. And we're going to like bridge that gap. And so when I like take it down to this little very micro level of parenting is a huge way that culture shifts. And I do see that shift towards worthiness happening in some parenting philosophies. And so it gives me hope when I think, okay, yeah, large scale, what can I do? You know, you can get kind of overwhelmed with like, what can I do? And so I love your call of like, we're not like boxing away darkness. We're like fostering that light that's within us. And as we parent, as we connect with people in community, that light grows, you know, and I know you're also like a social justice advocate. And so it's not this passive thing. It's a very active thing to be fostering light. But I really appreciate the way you shifted that on its
Well,
head
thank you.
for me.
And look, I want to hold space for, people who still identify with religion or with Christianity or like whatever it is. And look, the macro that I'm talking about is for thousands of years, Christ became this outward thing that you had to impress. Uh, and of course, you're not going to feel worthy, right? And so a lot of my view about Christianity has become this idea of, look, when you can't find it in yourself, you're going to automatically project it onto something else, right? So if you can't find the worthiness within yourself, you're then going to just say, oh, this guy Jesus has it, and therefore I have to worship him, right? And what I discovered through my religious studies and through my actual relationship with this man is like, not once did he ever ask to be worshipped, not once. And
Right.
and he just said, follow me. But we don't even necessarily like that's contextual too. And the reality was Jesus was saying like, if you like whatever I am, you are too. So discover it within yourself. And that's the transformation work. And so this worthiness wound is changing this belief of original sin. And again, those things come up not because they're true, but they came into existence because that's what the writers believed about themselves, right? Like, how could it not become a staple of history? If someone's experiencing slavery or experiencing like, genocide or whatever it may be, like if you don't have the capacity to transform yourself, you then apply it at these sort of macro levels. But the real work for me with religion or with Christ or with whatever is saying that it was always meant to be a transformation work here. And then the labels fall off. And then, Jesus says to me, I write about this in my book. Had a conversation with him in prison, like real in meditation. And he said, if it bothers you, let it go. Let it go. If I'm getting in the way, let it go. And whatever is getting in the way of your seeing yourself as worthy, let it go. Just it just is getting in the way. So just that's the real transformation work, and that's the freedom you find though too. You find this freedom in, oh, I'm not all these labels. I'm not all these things. I'm just a human being. Um, and what a beautiful capacity that that opens up for seeing other people. It's like one of the things I had to do in prison, which I think is probably pretty applicable to today is, um, I had a lot of trouble with Trump, as a lot of people do. Is like, and this was back in 2016, 2017, and 18, and one of the things my meditation taught me was you don't know how many lifetimes you've lived, and more likely than not, in a previous lifetime, you were a Trump. And in that lifetime, you depended upon someone else like you to help get you to where you are in this lifetime. So you never know when you are the person that is meant to help someone get to somewhere else in their lifetime. And that just creates a little bit more space and a little bit more empathy of like, there's no way we're all Trumps at some point in former lives. No way. Right? So, okay, in lifetime two, right, I'm trying to work towards this thing. I might not get there, but I'm relying on the empathy and compassion of other people to help me get there, maybe lifetime three or lifetime four. And that's the work that we can do now is holding that space and that empathy for everybody.
Yeah, that's really inspiring, that perspective of compassion. And that's been my experience of you this whole episode. I'm so grateful that you showed up as you are and showed us your humanity. Man, you're just like such a like beautiful soul, and I'm so grateful that we connected. Beyond all your labels, I'm so grateful that you dug in and showed us your heart. You speaking of labels though, bringing them back around, you do offer services to people. We'll talk about in a second like an opportunity for a donation you have going on, but first, could you take us through like your work now? Like, what do you offer to people?
Yeah, I mean, Holly, thanks so much. I mean, what a kind thing to say. So thank you. We started Northwest Wisdom, which is a nonprofit, because we want healing to be accessible to all people, especially people in marginalized situations. It's like when I got out of prison, I had nothing. I mean, yes, I had a master's degree, but I couldn't get a job for 2 years, right? Like, and even then, even since then, it's been a struggle. So Northwest Wisdom is all about providing the healing modalities, which a lot of people need and deserve, to marginalized people that can't afford it. Like, look, like I'm never gonna have, millions of dollars to do endless retreats in Bali. Like, no judgment, but like, how can we make these things accessible to other people? And so we offer spiritual counseling. I do spiritual counseling, energy healing, and Reiki, and life coaching. We also have another certified life coach. We have yoga instructor. So the idea is just to allow this these sort of modalities to become accessible to people if they want them. And so that's kind of what we're doing as a nonprofit is we're doing workshops and retreats. So yeah, we're just kind of opening that space, and there's such a need for community, right? So like for people who maybe don't identify as a Christian or whatever religion anymore, there's still that need for community. And so our Northwest Wisdom space is a space beyond those labels and saying, come as you are, and that's good enough. And share your story and connect with other people's story.
Beautiful. Yeah, and we'll put all your resources and links and socials we'll make that available for people, as well as a link to your book. Highly recommend. There's even more stories and wisdom that RG's gained in his book. So highly recommend that. And as we're kind of landing the plane here, we also wanted to let everyone know that, I'll actually have you speak about it a bit, RG, that there's an opportunity to donate, for us to donate to Northwest Wisdom for incarcerated or formerly incarcerated people to have access to this work. Could you tell us a bit more about that opportunity?
Yeah, thank you again. Look, again, the idea is to get this in the hands of people who are looking for it. And I've had multiple people reach out after reading articles or reading about my book or reading my book. I've had people in prison reach out, formerly incarcerated people reach out saying, I need help, but I don't have any money, right? And I can't afford it, or I'm not in a space to be able to pay for that. And so what we're looking to do as a nonprofit is raise awareness and raise money so that these people can have access to these things, whether it's my book or spiritual counseling or life coaching to help people find jobs after getting out. Like we're looking to raise enough money that that money can then be accessible to those people. And then, we're looking for that fund to be able to fund people to come to our workshops for free so that we're no
Mm-hmm.
longer having to charge people. And so this is a way for people. The donations is actually through Zephy, which is a platform, a fundraising platform that's specifically for nonprofits. And so every single dollar goes to the nonprofit. There's no hidden fees or
Mm-hmm.
processing fees. So that's just like really cool. And so, yeah, we're raising money, and all that money is going to go to people who can't afford the healing that they deserve. And so we're really asking, even if it's donating $1, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
a dollar helps someone. And then part of that fund is also we're looking at putting the book The Ocean Inside Me into prisons so that people who are still
Wow.
incarcerated have access to that book. Because in my book, The Ocean Inside Me, there's like at the end of several chapters, there's like here's how you can meditate or here's how you can begin to reflect. So there's like little bits of information of how I did it that can become accessible to people in prison who are looking for, well, how do I begin this spiritual journey?
Incredible. So we'll put that donation link, the Zephy, available for everyone.
Thank you
And
so
thank you
much.
for the beautiful work that you're doing. I'm so glad that we met you. I'm still struck by, like, we set out to, let's talk about dehumanization and how we can hold our own humanity, because that will help us hold each other. And we had no idea the kind of people that were going to find us and say, we're doing that in our own way. So thank you for being a part of that.
And thank you both for, I mean, you've created this space, right? Like, how beautiful is that, that you're doing the work in creating the space for people to come and humanize each other. So,
Thank
thank
you.
you both. And I want to honor that in you, in both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I'm going to read a little excerpt from your book before we end. There's some practices in there. Like you said, there's really practical tools, but even just seeing your arc and your trajectory is like part of what's so helpful too in the story. But I know for me, there's already been some practices that like I've applied to my life, and I'm so grateful. So I want this book to get into people's hands, and I'm grateful for you doing the work to help people have access to these resources, because we've talked about it before. Therapy, healing, all of these things they're luxuries. I mean, they're essential luxuries. And so there is a gap between the people who need them and being able to get those resources to them. So I'm really grateful for the work you're doing, and we're excited to champion that and put it out in the world too, and hopefully help. But before we kind of sign off, I just want to read, this is part of one of the meditations after the end of one of the chapters. So I'm going to read this to you. My friends, be compassionate with yourselves and be willing to hold the both and within you. You are not just your traumas, your fears, and your shames. You are not just a decaying body or skin woven tightly over memories you wish you didn't have. You are a vibrant light that never fades, a divine energy that began long before your smaller self. You are a star that eternally burns and outshines all shadow. This is the zenith of compassion, to be seen. So RG, we're so grateful that you let us see you and see your story, that we can see ourselves in your story, that you can see yourself in our story is so beautiful and profound. And so thank you. Thank you again for your time and for your wisdom. We're so grateful you were here. And so to all our listeners and to you, RG, I just want to remind you that you are an absolute badass and the most fragile thing. Treat yourself as both. Thanks, friends.